So I got this interesting question, and I think it deserves a response. It says, do you have any thoughts on where the architecture of Dookie came from? Would love to see you make a video on this. In order to talk about Dookie very well, we would first have to understand exactly where it is and where it falls in the history of Kerma. It's located very near Kerma, and also it's located right next to the Dongala site, about an hour away if you travel by road. The most impressive thing about it is how old it is and how old the site that it's occupied has been occupied for, and the fact that the people who built this must have been native to this region. But even though it's located in North Sudan, it also has these circular structures, some of them more oval than others, linking it to the rest of Africa. Because, of course, the circular structures that are built are very typical of Sudanic and other various quote unquote sub Saharan African structures. Now, one part with a lot of people don't talk about is the fact you still have the typical rectangles from the Nile regions. And that's the second part about it. It's a Nilotic civilization. Kerma, of course, is not unfamiliar with circular structures, but perhaps what is more interesting here is things that were found this far in this region. And so, in this area, we do find certain things that are not associated with Africa. So, for example, in Africa, there's a common theme within the study of Sudan versus Egypt, which is they say that in Asia, it's like the flour version, and then in Africa, it's like the cooking version. So, in other words, the baking is a more Eastern thing, and cooking is a more Western, meaning African thing. So, in other words, things like flour, that type of stuff, grains that need to be crushed and then baked are more from the East. And then things like the cooking seeds, which still need to be crushed, but are more cooked in soups. These are versions of African. So, what do I mean by they are Nilotic civilizations? Well, I literally mean they are by the Nile, not that they're just in Sudan somewhere. And the reason why, of course, is the same reason that we see Egypt being by the Nile, because just beyond the Nile, you get desert. And then there's some inhabitable areas. But for the most part, most structures are going to be built by the Nile. You see there the city of Kerma, which is right next to Dukki, and you can see there the pre-Kerma civilization on the other side of Dukigel. And like I said, if you keep going down, you're going to reach Dongala. And as you can see, if you keep going up directly to the Nile, you will reach Kadanarti. This is the top view of Dukigel. And as you can see, this structure, this is an actual photograph. This structure of Dukigel shows distinctive African features. So, for example, you can see these circular patterns with like gateways coming through it, almost looking similar to what they were used for in places like Great Zimbabwe. Another thing you can see there is these enclosures. So, there's a lot of buildings within buildings, and then, of course, roads, which a lot of people assumed did not exist in this part of Africa until the ancient Egyptians put it down, which is not true. Now, this part was occupied by the ancient Egyptians at some point, and they did introduce and reintroduce certain architectural styles. So that must be kept in mind. Now, of course, it's important to remind you that since it's located so close to the Nile, it has other similarities with Egypt, namely the fact that the civilization as well was following in the same traditions and religious structure as those located in the city of Kerma, which we know is just about the same as the ones in ancient Egypt. Now, building wise, it's easy and difficult at the same time to think that the stone structures, if we can call it that, inside of Dukki have the similar origin to those located in Egypt. In fact, it's probable that they started in this type of region and ended up in Egypt. Older structures inside of Sudan have led some people to suggest that Egypt, just like the Nubians suggested inside of that Greek writer's book, that Egypt is a colony of the Sudanic or the Nubian people. Mud brick obviously predates brick, and over here we can see that the mud brick was also present in this region. More importantly, the mud brick present in Egypt at about the same time tells us that there must have been structures of similarity. Because, of course, you don't just invent mud brick 100 times in similar regions, as we see when it is invented in West Africa. It is then distributed throughout the regions when it's invented. I mean, think of a good example in South Africa amongst the Khoi. We don't see any signs that it was invented in that region, and it doesn't propagate. And so in this region, the Nile, we have no reason to believe it happened more than once. Instead, the thought is that these civilizations, the mud bricks that you find in ancient Egypt, which people don't even know there's mud brick buildings from there, and the mud brick buildings that you find from south of Egypt are all connected to one technological expansion, which led to the creation of the adobe or the brick culture. The kings of Kerma, who ruled all the way south, even to South Sudan, and ruled all the way to north in Egypt, we can easily put in between the civilization. And also, we can talk about how, certain structures would be found within this civilization. But it's actually more important than this because during ancient Egypt's time, all the way to Punt, remember there are some times when Egypt was in such domination that they would be ruling the top part of the Nile, Egypt, all the way down to the south, meaning they would have a drop of influence in the land of Punt and have a complete control of those regions, even dropping locations near Kerma and those areas. As fun as it is to link Egypt in a mental state, in a mental way, so in other words, drawing similarities between these two areas and saying there are a lot of similarities, therefore they have some similarities and must have originated from some similar source, we need to do better than that. And of course, in order to do that, we would have to look up excavations from similar regions. Now, remember, Kerma is right next to this civilization. This civilization seems to have been occupied at least around 2000 BC to later dates, obviously. I mean, even till now, as as if you check, you can see there are houses around this area, this undisturbed area, luckily, because a lot of ruins from Sudan have been moved in order to build houses in the very useful areas, wet areas of Sudan. Now, what is this picture that I'm showing you? Well, in an excavation done a long time ago in Kerma, they found this female. Who is she? Well, that's the interesting part. So, like I said, 1800 BC is about the date they give for the civilization. This is Senewi, a female. If we read her title, it's The Sculpture of Lady Senewi in situ during excavation at Kerma, Sudan, Harvard University Museum of Fine Arts expedition in 1913, 2011 Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, negative. But what is she doing here? And how old is she? Well, Senewi, as we can compare, is the same Senewi that we find in Egypt. But at what time? Well, if we look at her sculpture, you can see that she's holding the same thing that she was holding in her hand, and she probably had a lot of power to some degree. The fact that her statue is found this far south and this early is an indicator of pure connection between these two regions. But like I said again, how would we know how old she is? It's just a statue of a random woman, except that it's not. This is the wife of a man who was alive during Senraset's time. So let's compare the dates. Senraset is about 1900 BC. And exactly what date is this one from? Well, 1900 BC. And this is where the difference is made. So, the connection between Egypt and this land is confirmed, but it's confirmed in a deeper sense. Remember this picture? This is an image of a ruler, a chief inside of Nubia, Egypt. This chief, as you can see, represented the Nubians as drawn. He represents a certain culture, though, that existed at about the same time that all three of these things existed. So you have dookie, you have ancient Egypt with Senraset at the head, and then you have the Pangraves representing circular fashions of structure. But wait a minute, these circular structures found in Nubia, they can't be fully connected with Africa in general. Wasn't that an isolated thing in that region? Well, not quite. Because, of course, in Kerma, we find similarities between this Nubian culture and this Kermatic culture. And it was actually documented in the 1913s when the Pangraves were first discovered. And so we read in 1913, a Harvard University Boston of Fine Arts expedition discovered at Kerma in Nubia a large burial mound with a tomb under it surrounded by several smaller tombs, pangraves within the main tomb, two large granite statues of Jafar Herpi and his wife, Senui, were discovered. Evidence shown that the occupants of the satellite tombs were sacrificed altogether, likely at the time of their lord's death, in a ritual long lost in Egypt, but evidently still performed in Nubia. Initial claims that the owner of the main tomb was Jefaharpi have been largely superseded, and is now generally believed that its owner was rather a Nubian tribal chief, and that the two statues were brought here at a later date, perhaps during the Second Intermediate Period. Jefaharpi statue is shattered, but Senui's is well preserved, and both are exhibited nowadays in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So let's get back to Marcel Taylor's original question. do you have any thoughts on where the architecture of Dookie came from? Would love to see you make a video on this. Well, the architecture of Dukki seems to have come from original African structures, and it seems to have been built up and formulated in a similar way as the Pangraves, but it does not seem to have been isolated, not at least since its creation, as even earlier than the date that we start seeing the structures, there is a connection with ancient Egypt, and not ancient Egypt anywhere in ancient Egypt, but the Nubian culture of ancient Egypt, strict with its writing, strict with its all the elements. So we have the sacrifices, which we find in Kerma. We have the writing systems, which we do also find in Kerma, and we find in Dukigel, and we find in that center area, that island in between the Nile. And we have basically boat travel in this region going up and down the Nile. The Pangrave culture as well is probably the most connecting factor between these two states. So if this answers your question, thank you very much. I hope you give it a like and you understand the point that I'm coming with and why it differs a little bit from where other people come from, because I think some people look at this as like an isolated civilization, and I never looked at the Sudanic cultures as isolated, not even Dongala, which is, like I said, an hour away from this civilization directly. Now, before I end, I want to remind you that cattle is at the heart of both of these civilizations. And we know this about Kerma, but Dukigel, of course, because it's the first time I mention it, also it has to be emphasized that it is the type of colors that you see here, this thing that I talked about, this red ochre that you normally see in Africa, really only discovered in Africa, and then exported. And secondly, the black toppings. So you see this in the pottery. This is also being discovered in Kerma, Dukigel, anywhere around those other regions. And you will also see other, like the Cordobans and places like that, you will find the same structures, mostly associated with Nubian culture. Again, the Nubians from south of Egypt are connected to the Sudanic cultures. The connections, of course, don't end there, because remember, when Hatshepsut took over, she had influence of the entirety of Sudan, so much so that she could easily sail to the land of Punt and had details, recounts of the region, and even paintings. And remember her image of Sudanese people bringing her tribute. It's tempting to imagine that at least some of these people must have come from this specific location. So, again, I hope this answers your question. What do I think about Dookie Gell? This is what I think about. It's not my whole thought about it, because I think I will continue to make more videos about it. But thank you for asking the question. It's a very good one.